Welcome once again, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, to Mysteries from Beyond the Other Dominion. I'm your host, Dr. Franklin Ruehl. Now, suicides in the Bible. Roll tape! It's time to investigate suicides in the good book. But first, the trivia question of the day. Let me extricate here from his paper prison. The question: which book of the New Testament described the suicide of Judas Iscariot? Now, it's multiple choice: Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Now, the only prize for the correct answer is one pat on the back that you'll have to administer to yourself. If you want $1 million, call Meredith Vieira. But please, please do not call us. We do not have any operators to take your calls, and if we did, we still could not afford prizes. I'll take a sip of water and be back momentarily with that correct answer. Okay, we're calling time. And again, in which book of the New Testament was the suicide of Judas Iscariot described? Was it Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John? And of course I have to ask, is that your final answer? Matthew, you're absolutely right, yes. Now let's go to that. That was in Matthew chapter 27, verse 5. And he cast down the pieces of silver in the temple, and departed, and went, and hanged himself by the neck. Now, biblical scholars, i.e. exegesis, are a bit skeptical of this account because they ask, why is it not detailed in the other three main books describing Jesus' life? It's thought that perhaps Matthew added this as a bit of poetic justice, that Judas should have been punished. Now, there are 6 suicides detailed in the Old Testament, beginning with the case of Abimelech in the book of Judges, chapter 9, verses 53 and 54. And a certain woman cast a piece of a millstone upon Abimelech's head, and all to break his skull. Then he called hastily unto the young man his armor-bearer, and said unto him, Draw thy sword, and slay me, that men may not say of me that a woman slew me. And his young man thrust him through, and he died. Now the next suicide, also in the book of Judges, this is chapter 16, verse 30, involving Samson, the legendary muscle man of the Old Testament. And Samson said, Let me die with the Philistines. And he bowed himself with all his might. And the house fell upon the lords, and upon all the people that were therein. So the dead which he slew at his death were more than they which he slew in his life. Yes, he brought down a temple, crushed himself to death. Now the next suicide involves Saul, and that's detailed in the first book of Samuel, chapter 31, verse 4. Then said Saul unto his armor-bearer, Draw thy sword, and thrust me through therewith. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell upon it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell likewise upon his sword, and died also. 2 suicides for the price of 1. Now we go on to the second book of Samuel, and the suicide of a man named Ahithophel. This is in chapter 17, verse 23. And when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, no one was obeying him, he saddled his donkey and arose and gat him home to his house, to his city, and put his household in order, and hanged himself in the sepulchre, and died. So there we have a hanging. The next one is in the first book of Kings. This is Zimrek, chapter 16, verse 18. And it came to pass, when Zimrek saw that the city was taken, that he went into the palace of the king's house, and burnt the king's house over him with fire, and died. In other words, he immolated himself to death. Yes, so these suicides are all in the Old Testament. The only one in the New Testament, that of Judas. And one question is there any admonition against suicide in either the Old or New Testament? And the answer is no. Now, in the 5th century A.D., St. Augustine railed against suicide and actually claimed the Bible prohibits it. But that's not true. In fact, if we go to one more case, this would be Paul in Acts 16, verses 27 through 29. We have the case of an earthquake causing a jail wall to break open, and the jailer's afraid all the prisoners have escaped, and he's contemplating suicide. He said, and the keeper of the prison, awaking out of his sleep and seeing the prison doors open, he drew out his sword and would have killed himself, supposing that the prisoners had been fled. But Paul cried with a loud voice, saying, do thyself no harm, for we are all still here. They didn't escape. So he didn't say it was against the Lord's will to commit suicide. He simply said it would be a stupid thing to do. So suicide is very controversial. The first code of laws that mentioned suicide was the Codex Justinian, under Emperor Justinian. It forbade suicide, but actually allowed it under virtually every circumstance except for killing oneself to avoid punishment for a crime, in which type any property the suicide had would be taken by the state and denied his heirs. In the 10th century in England, strict laws against suicide were enacted, and the bodies of suicide victims were treated most disrespectfully, sometimes placed at a crossroads with a sword through them, other times dragged through the street. Their heirs would receive none of their property, and of course a suicide could not be buried in hallowed ground. Those laws were in effect in England until about 1870. And of course, this is a very controversial issue. If you have a pro or con suggestion or opinion on suicide, please contact me at one of the addresses shown at the end of the program.
Now, until next time, may the power of the cosmos be with you. Yes, yes, yes.